All right, exciting. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm so excited to be live right now with my good friend, Nathalie Molina Nino. I'm not going to screw it up just because I'm under pressure here, but she is the CEO and founder of BRAVA Investments and author of the new book, LEAPFROG, The New Revolution for Women Entrepreneurs, which is what we're really going to be talking about today. And I'm so excited that we are here together. She and I actually haven't had a chance to catch up in a long time, so this is really our big opportunity to do that. And for those of you who don't know me, because I know that Nathalie is also sharing this with her audience, my name is Adda Birnir, and I am the founder and CEO of a company called Skillcrush. And Skillcrush is an online tech education company whose mission is to empower women of all ages, ethnicities, and levels of education to enter high-earning and flexible careers in tech, which I believe Nathalie is a mission that Nathalie is in support of, which is why she was nice enough to feature me in the book, which is what we're going to be talking about a little bit. And today we're really going to be talking about women and entrepreneurialism and tech and how they all come together. And I think most importantly, you know, how we can sort of boil this all down to something that is really meaningful to you, our audience, and can impact your life and career, and sort of help you be, you know, one of the things I really look forward to talking about is thinking about these different tools and hacks and things that we can use to really advance our own careers and also advance, you know, sort of allow
womankind.
Yes, exactly. Help women all over the world and really sort of like usher in the world and kind of, you know, industry and economic situation that we want to see for everyone. So I also just want to let you guys know that we are going to be doing a very special giveaway at the end. And most importantly, like, this is a two-way conversation, but it's also a conversation that we want to include all of you all in. So we would love to have any questions that you guys have. We would love to answer them. We're really here for you guys. Because as you know, as much as Nathalie and I like to talk to each other, we could just get coffee and not do it on Facebook. So we want to make sure that you guys get something out of this also. So Nathalie, could you start by just talking a little bit about your background? Obviously, I know that you have a really storied career, but just talk a little bit about sort of what brought you to founding BRAVA Investments and also writing this book and how the two sort of fit together.
Yeah, totally. I'm a recovering techie. I worked as, you know, and my early career was all about founding companies in the tech space. We're helping existing companies grow. So I've been an entrepreneur or an entrepreneur my entire life. And I hear a little bit of an echo. Can you hear it, or is it okay?
I do hear it. I think it might be because you're not wearing headphones. Do you have a pair of headphones by chance? Okay, let's plug those in and see if that helps.
Totally. All right.
Technology.
How's this? Any better?
Yeah, I don't hear the echo.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, recovering tech entrepreneur, you know, realized that I wanted to clear the way for the next generation of women entrepreneurs, hoping that they could have it a little easier, right, than me starting out 20 years ago. Co-founded the Center for Women Entrepreneurs that sits inside of Birnir, which is how you and I met. And really in that time focused exclusively on working with women entrepreneurs. And it occurred to me that we have a bunch of gaps. And one of the biggest ones, and the one that I felt the most passionate about, was that we were lacking capital. We were lacking, you know, economic resources. And that was just really holding us back. I wanted to do something about that. And so that prompted me to become a full-time investor, which is what I am. And BRAVA focuses on investing only in companies that can prove to me that they're making an economic impact on as many women as possible. So really at scale. But what I've learned, and part of the reason for the book, which I know you have your copy, I have mine, is that as an investor, it doesn't matter who you are, you spend whatever, upwards of 90, if not more than that, % of your time saying no, right? And in some cases saying no to really great businesses that deserve to get investment or get resources, but they just don't meet my thesis, right? I have a very specific thesis. I do healthcare, education, consumer. They have to be a certain stage. So I get perfectly great companies coming to me that simply don't meet my thesis, and I have to say no a lot. And so for me, the motivation behind the book is to have something to give all of those especially women entrepreneurs, even though I've been told multiple times now that the content really applies to anyone. But I wanted to give a set of resources to women entrepreneurs because there has never, at least in my life, and Adda, I'd be really curious to hear about you, but I have never read a business book that felt like it reflected my experience, the fact that I didn't have friends and family that could write big checks, all of the things that were, I thought, sort of unique to my struggle in some ways, but it turns out it's not unique to me. Most Americans don't have $5,000 in their bank account, in their savings account. So I'm not unique. It turns out the majority of us have a different experience of entrepreneurship than what's in the books. And so I wanted to write a book that finally talked about our experiences and helped us, given the tools and the frameworks that we have.
Yeah, I love two things that you're saying. One, that you're a recovering tech entrepreneur who's now made it her job to convince a bunch of other people to become tech entrepreneurs. But also, yeah, and it's also an irony, right? That unfortunately, even with you, like in your position at BRAVA Investments, you still have to say no to probably a lot of women and women of color. And that's just because that's like the reality of the situation. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in terms of capitalization of women and women-owned businesses, but I would actually love to take it a step back because I know that for a lot of my audience, they're not necessarily like, there's all this crazy data which you have shared, and I've heard you talk about how many women are starting businesses, which is unreal and amazing. Yeah. And especially women of color. But I think what, I know for a lot of our audience, they're kind of like almost in the position before you start that business where they're kind of like, I don't like my job. I feel really frustrated. Maybe I'm underemployed or I'm making less money than I want to make. I want to change, but I don't know what that change should look like. Yeah. So I guess like my first question is, why should women consider entrepreneurship, period? Especially, given all of the things that we hear about it being risky and scary and like, oh my God, you're not going to get any money. So like, why would I even sort of dive into that like pit of snakes?
Yeah, I mean, there are 5 sections in the book, right? It's structured and you can start from the beginning or the middle or whatever, but of the 5 sections, only one of them is related to funding. So I'm glad that you pointed that out because that isn't the, only part of this conversation. In fact, we start by sort of setting ready, set, go, fund, grow are the 5 sections, and ready and set, you could argue, are kind of about what you're talking about. It's about before you even get started, right? Before you run a race, you kind of have to visualize how you're going to do it, right? And I think that a lot of it is that mind game. It's the perspective. It's what you're talking about in terms of even seeing yourself as an entrepreneur. So many of the people that are in the situation that you just described, where they might be underemployed, they might have a side hustle. They don't see themselves as being entrepreneurs. And the thing is that they are, right? That's an entrepreneurial endeavor. Or you have a full-time job, but you're rocking it, and part of the reason that you are doing so well at it is because you're being entrepreneurial inside of a corporate environment, right? You're acting like you own it. You're giving people value, you're solving problems, you're doing all of the things that entrepreneurs do. And that's part of why you're doing so well in your career. So I tend to think of it not as like a career path, and I tend to think of it more as like a life skill, right? It doesn't matter who you are. If you're entrepreneurial at it, you're probably going to be helped by that, right? So that would be my number one answer to like why entrepreneurship, because it's a life skill, it's a job skill, it's a thing that's going to make you have a competitive edge over anyone else. And then the second thing is, it's funny when women talk about women and men, right? And even studies talk about how different people deal with risk. There's an old sad, and if you saw my interview on CNBC, you saw my reaction when I got asked this. There's this old sad misconception that women are more risk averse, and there is no study to support that. And in fact, if we look at the real hard facts of it, if we were risk averse, we'd never leave the front door, right? And so
which some people don't. And you know what? Thanks to the computer and the internet,
they can still have like successful businesses.
Not that we're supporting that, but it's an option. Anyways, go on.
I know there's a career path for agoraphobia.
I think I might teach some of them. I might be one myself sometimes.
No one would believe me because I think that everyone just assumes I'm such an extrovert. And I actually think of myself as an extreme extrovert, but every once in a while I hole up and don't see anyone for days at a time. So I feel it. But no, I think the other thing is that, we forget that, for example, corporates are complaining that women and especially people of color are leaving the corporate environments, right? And so earlier you were talking about how I'm a I'm a serial or maybe a recovering, startup junkie, but I'm convincing other people to do it. And the reality is to your point, I'm actually not convincing anybody to be entrepreneurial. Women already are. And like you were saying, right, we're starting businesses more than men, but we're just getting stuck at that less than $1 million mark, which is what you're describing, right? These like micro businesses, which if that's what you've chosen and that's working for you and that's feeding your family and it's giving you what you need, great. But I find it really hard to believe that all women want micro businesses, that all women aren't trying to get over that $1 million a year in revenue mark. And so I wanted to equip them with a set of tools. And I think that when you think about who those women are who leave before they get to those C-level positions that all the corporates are complaining about because they're trying to get more women to, move up the corporate ladder, where do they go when they quit? And there's this conception that like they couldn't hack it. They couldn't, deal with the obligations of a high-powered job. And yet they leave and they start businesses. They start, they take that side hustle that they were doing when they had a full-time job and they turn it into a company. And I guarantee you that woman is not working less as an entrepreneur than she was in that corporate job. So, I feel like we're already doing it. We're already making the jump. We're already taking the risks. We're just getting stuck at this small business or businesses that aren't thriving the way that they could be. And that's, I guess, what I'm really focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with you. I think that like often what people think about it, a lot of women are seeing this not as I'm starting a business, but like I'm going to go freelance, I'm going to side hustle, everything you're talking about. But it's like starting to reframe that and understand that like freelancing is a business. You know what I mean? Like the first thing you should do is create an LLC because like you want to protect yourself and your assets, and that is a business entity. And then I think you're right. I mean, I think that it is interesting, like your point, like obviously, some people for whatever combination of reasons might want to just be like, for example, a solopreneur, right? Right. Might want to create a business where it's just them. But it is true. Like, it's always this question of like, are you freely making a choice, or is the system telling you that this is the only choice that you have? Yeah. And I think it's so important to reframe for people and say like, if you want to do that, that's fine. But you're perfectly capable of hiring a whole team of people and blowing this out and doing something crazy. And I also think the other thing that you're saying is really important is that it's funny, this whole issue of risk, because of course there is risk in starting a business, but there's also risk in being completely reliant on an employer. And I think actually like a lot of people who are freelancing and doing side hustles are doing that out of like the reverse risk, right? And like, I think for myself, like that was one of the most empowering things I ever did, was learn how to make money without needing someone specifically to hire me.
Yeah. And you went through multiple layoffs, right? I mean, I don't know if you wanted to get into it now, but I would love to talk about your story because it's a perfect segue, right? I felt like it was such a compelling story about you looking at basically the lemons you kept getting handed, and deciding, you know what, this is a pain in the ass and I'm going to solve it. And somehow, in that pain, the way that Nellie Galan in her book, Self-Made, which I love, and I mentioned in the book a bunch, sort of in your pain is your brand. Like there was this pain and you turned it into a business. And that's part of what the hack that you're in is all about, right? This idea of, I just don't think that follow your bliss is a thing. I think that if you have resources, if you have a trust fund, if you have the flexibility to do the thing that you love, if you love, underwater basket weaving, by all means, like go for it, but that might not be the most marketable thing. That might not be something that the market wants to pay for, right? So I just think this whole follow your bliss thing is not for most of us. And so I would rather people solve a problem, an acute problem, something that you want to punch, something that makes you really passionate, because then they might end up with a story like yours.
Yeah, I think, it's really, I think this goes back to this issue of risk again, which is this question of like, risk is like a very, like to think about quitting and starting a business as a risky endeavor is like, it's true, I guess, but it's also like, that assumes a bunch of things that are very privileged, which is that you have a really freaking great job that's like working for you and you're going to do this risky thing. But like, yeah, you're right. Like that was 100% not my situation. Like I had no job. So like trying to freelance was not risky. It was like survival instinct taking hold. And it's interesting because it's like, as I'm thinking about this in terms of like freelancing to like, like I had to, do that step by step. Like I definitely did not start off and be like, I'm starting a business. Like I joke that I very much sort of found myself like maybe 6 months into my first business being like, oh, this is a business. I have now realized that. And I had to sort of reframe my thinking, and then I had to reframe it again to start thinking about scale, which is something that you're talking about. And like that, like, you know, in retrospect, it all happened very fast, but it didn't feel fast in the time. And it definitely wasn't instantaneous. And it definitely took me a lot of sort of iterations and figuring it out. I do think
for people that don't know your story, and how did you end up without a job, and how did the whole thing start?
You want me to tell you my story? I'm like,
I'm interviewing you.
I know. Yeah. So my story, and I'm worried now. I'm getting feedback. Do you hear that? Hopefully it's just me.
I'm not. I didn't hear an echo.
All right. You guys will let us know if it's driving you all nuts. But yeah, so my story is that I got summarily laid off. I mean, I basically was at one company. They laid off a bunch of people. I got spooked, went to another company thinking it would be safer, and then immediately got laid off. And it was 2009. So like everything was just, I mean, it was just a disaster. And it was horrible. And at the same time, in retrospect, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it was that kick in the ass for me, you know, because I think like I had aspirations, I had interests. I wanted to learn how to code. I wanted to do more technical things. I wanted more out of my, you know, I felt underutilized and underpaid at work. And this sort of gave me the opportunity to, it was like, well, you lost everything you had to lose. So now what are you going to do about it? And it was like, okay, well, I want to do these things like learn to code. And I also think that it's possible that that could be a way for me to make money. So yeah, and it was hard, but it also worked. Like I started making money almost right away. And that was a great motivator for me to keep going. And I sort of built it up from there. And then I ended up doing business I think in some ways was similar to yours, although yours was much, much bigger than mine ever was in terms of this business. I started building websites for companies.
That's what I started with.
Yeah, which is a great way to start. And I think that gave me a lot of experience quickly. I worked for a lot of different companies, a lot of different industries, learned a lot. It was like a little, I don't know if MBA is the right word, but it was just like a great 2-year kind of boot camp in building your website after website and started working with clients and doing all these things. And then at that point, you know, I got inspired and I was sort of watching, this is probably now like 2011. And I was watching all these other startups start and do really well. And it was kind of like, you know, why not me? I know how to code. Like, I want to start a scalable startup and do that thing. And so then I started exploring that. And like, you know, that also like it's not like I wish I could say that Skillcrush came fully formed out of my brain and like became, you know what I mean, the company that it is today, but that isn't the case at all. Like we played around with a lot of different ideas, tested a lot of different things. And, you know, I was really lucky, like to be honest with you, Skillcrush was the side project. Like I actually didn't think it had a viable business model.
Yeah. Well, and it probably didn't as it first came out, right? But it evolved like everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's been amazing. And it's just, and, you know, and I think there's a certain amount of like, you are in the driver's seat and at the same time you're along for the ride. And that's part of the fun of it. I think it's probably like it's probably like life to a certain extent. Yeah.
One thing that I love about your story that's different than mine that I think that is highly relatable, given that, like, for example, you know, we're graduating, and hopefully this will change, but right now we're graduating half as many women in engineering as we were when I was graduating, right? And so I love that in your case, yes, you started doing something similar to me, you started making websites, but you were not an engineer. That's not what you studied in school. And that to me was the most compelling thing. What did you study?
Art and African American studies. It's funny. I feel like everyone thought I was so weird doing African American studies at the time, and I feel like they've come around to see it my way. So yeah, it was great. I loved it. I mean, it was a liberal arts education, and I think it prepared me in every way possible, except with no practical skills.
But you made it happen, right? And I mean, I think that was the thing that a lot of entrepreneurs do, right? Is that you looked around and you were like, what's the repeating sort of theme here, right? The repeating theme is that people who don't code keep getting fired first. And so boom, right?
Yeah, I think it was that and a combination of being like looking at where the world was going and being like you like everyone knows where the world is going. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like It's not like this is not like a secret I'm only in on. I'm just gonna like try to take advantage of it. And it really, really worked. I mean, I found that like what was amazing to me right when I started sort of working in tech or like really transitioning to the more technical side is I felt like my biggest qualifier was not skills. It was like interest. It was like, oh, you're interested in like talking about, how to build an app? Great. Like, thank God for you, because so many people I think were at that time, especially like afraid of it, especially in any industry that wasn't like so technical. So like in media, for example, and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. I think, I was listening to you on an interview and somebody was talking about like sort of following the roles and this idea there's like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and how like often you can just go from 1 to 4. And that's like what a lot of people and especially a lot of women are afraid to do. And that's kind of what you're arguing for is like the hacks, you know what I mean? These are shortcuts, but they're not like in a bad way.
No.
And I was thinking about that for myself because I remember having a conversation with my dad a couple years into Skillcrush and thinking about how like I feel like in terms of structural things, like building Skillcrush has not been that hard. Like I haven't raised a lot of money. I didn't have a lot of technical skills that, I like taught them to myself, et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of like, okay, so why hasn't everyone started Skillcrush? And I think that the answer to that question is like, because they didn't like know that they could. And like that sort of feeling of like not believing that you can do it and not knowing that it's for you is actually like the biggest barrier often.
Yeah. And I will say this, I believe that 100% to be true. And I think that one of the things that concerns me and part of the reason that I'm so adamant about these hacks is that what we discovered when we were testing out names was I wanted to put the word shortcuts somewhere in the cover of the book. I mean, if it were up to me, I might have even called the book Shortcuts. But it tested poorly. Women, and especially women of color, heard shortcuts and they actually were hearing cheating, right? But I would say, like, one of the things that I talk about in the book, and I think this is credit to you, is that we're also, and this is men and women, this is the startup industry generally, we're really precious about sharing our ideas because we think people are going to steal them. And I talk about how, like, just become a walking sandwich board, like tell everybody your idea because that's how the idea evolves. That's how people poke holes in your idea. That's how you iterate, right? And that's how it gets better. And I think that the reason that I tell people that they can do that is because I, as an investor, get pitched the same idea so many times over and over again that I have fun. And I'm like,
what's everyone pitching you?
Oh man. But the thing is I'm not discouraged, right? I'm not thinking, oh, here it is again. What I look for when I see the same idea pitched to me a bunch of times is who's going to be the best at executing. And I think that in your case, yes, the barrier to entry might be low. And we do have a cultural problem of women not realizing that they can scale businesses and that they can get to these levels, partly because it's true. A lot of the resources are not as available to them as they are to men. And hopefully we'll change that. But I also think that execution is key, right? And you have executed and you were like, I remember, right, when we first met, like you had your moments, you're human. You had your doubts, you had your, oh my God, is this really going to be a thing? But you didn't stop.
I still have them all day long, every day.
And at the end of the day, you out-executed people, right? Which I think is a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny too, because it's not even like it's a competition necessarily. Like, I know that we're all like we all sort of do end up comparing ourselves to others. I mean, I think there's been so many lessons along the way.
I think less as a competition and more as in like, why haven't other training platforms targeting women? Where have they fallen short? Some of it may be the systemic issues that you and I talk about, but I think that there's a part of why Skillcrush is where it is just a testament to the fact that you persisted, right?
Yes. I mean, yeah, I do think there's so much I could say about this topic. I'm like, where to begin? I think that fundamentally business is like, I do really believe that like business is about continuing. Like people talk about businesses failing, and I think that that's not failure. Like you could fail. Like let's say you could Tesla, for example, could try to, or SpaceX could try to do a rocket ship and it could fail. Like it could fail at whatever they're trying to do. And maybe they lose a bunch of money, but like SpaceX doesn't fail unless they decide to close up shop and not do it anymore.
Right.
And I think that is something that people don't understand about business. Like I've had $0 in the bank account. I've had negative $0, negative below $0 in the bank account. And obviously that's horrible and I don't recommend it. And there are reasons why you should, close up and stop. But at the end of the day, it's a decision that you make to stop doing something that you don't think it's worth it to keep investing your time. I think that people have this idea that it happens to you. And I think especially at those early stages, I don't know. It's very complicated, and it has everything to do with your background and your savings account and how many hits you can take. But at the same time, and I want to both acknowledge that I'm married and I don't have a trust fund, but I do have a safety net in that. Obviously I have parents whose house I could go live at if I needed to, you know what I mean? My ability to eat and have a roof over my head is not at stake with whether Skillcrush survives. Which is important. But at the same time, it's important to know that to a certain extent, it is just about your ability to persevere and keep going.
Yeah. And I think that the thing is I was finding a whole bunch of advice that was steering people in directions that didn't work in their context, right? So this business, for example, of you can't even apply to certain incubators unless you are all in. It cannot be your side hustle. You cannot have a day job. You have to have quit that and be completely in, or you won't even be considered for some of these top incubators. And it's well, who wants to live in a frat house for 3 months? And how conducive is that for people with families, men or women? And, we know that women over the age of 50 are twice as likely to be more successful at entrepreneurship. Why aren't the incubators filled with them? If we cared about data and we cared about actually putting our money in the places that are more likely to be successful, the ecosystem would look very different from what it looks like today. And so I think that for me, it was about saying, okay, it's all right to have a side hustle, right? It's okay to experiment while you take care of your safety net, right? Because some people's safety nets are, not much of anything, right? I mean, some people, you are your safety net. Your salary is your safety net, to your point, right? Not the parents, not the lawyer friends, not all the other resources that other people might have at their disposal. And so the way that they treat that day job is very different than somebody else. And so I wanted to set up a whole different set of stories in a way, which is why I'm so honored that so many of you let me tell your stories in the book, right? Because people often come to me and say, okay, fine, maybe you're right. Maybe not everybody needs venture capital, but if you want to grow and you want to grow fast, that's the only way to do it. And to them, I say, you know what? Nina Vaca, she has $1 billion company. It's the fastest growing woman-owned company in the United States. She never took a penny of outside capital. And it's what are you talking about? It's the fastest growing woman-owned company in America. Don't tell me that the only way to do this is via VC, right?
Yeah. I mean, also Shibani, isn't that, I mean, this is totally, I mean, no, it's total. I mean, I'm it's just a terrible, I don't know. I think when I get most cynical, I'm it's just a hazing ritual for the worst. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? A lottery system. I don't know. I think it's not. It's just a bunch of nonsense is what it is.
Yeah, but it's nonsense that turns into, a whole segment of the population being shut out. And I think that's what I want to sort of underscore to people is that instead of spending a bunch of time and energy talking about how the system isn't fair and how people take shortcuts and people, have connections and, so-and-so started their company because they made a few phone calls to their, whatever, rich Harvard friends, I almost feel that's wasted energy. We can spend a bunch of energy talking about how the system might not be fair and it might be shutting us out, or we could spend a bunch of time building our own hacks, building our own shortcuts, figuring out our own ways. And part of it is what you said in the very beginning, right? Part of it is about us getting out of our own way and being okay with that and not equating shortcuts with cheating and realizing that everybody who has ever been successful, everyone who has power and capital, did it because they took some sort of shortcut. So let's just find our own. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting in your book. Like, you told a story. Like, one of the things in your book is you are very much pushing the tech angle, right? Like, you told a story about, I think his name is John.
Henry,
Did you tell the
John
story?
Henry.
Yeah, yeah.
He's the only VC in Harlem. He's fantastic, or him and his group, right? Harlem Capital. But he didn't start as a techie at all, right? He started a really simple brick and mortar business. It wasn't even, you couldn't even argue that it was a brick and mortar business. It was more of a service business, right? They were in the business of getting a bunch of doormen from around New York City together, and having them deliver basically laundry all around the city. And they had this one laundry service, and all he did was provide the transportation, essentially, with these people who already had access to all these customers in these buildings. And once that was up and running, once that company was profitable, once it was a full-fledged real business that was growing and that sort of had its own life, then he took the earnings from the company, and instead of buying himself a fabulous house and a fancy car or whatever, he reinvested it in his company, and as a secondary step said, all right, how do I scale this? I'm going to do it with tech. Right. So then he built his app, and then he hired people to come in and sort of infuse technology into his business. And that's when it became something that the investors were interested in. That's when it became something that people thought, well, okay, this can scale. And that's ultimately how it got to the point where it could be acquired. And I can't remember how old he was, but he was still like 21.
I think 21. Yeah, is what you said.
When he sold his company, right? And now he's an investor, and he does a bunch of real estate, and like he has a show on Vice, and he has an incubator in Harlem, and like he is doing not just well for himself, he's paying it forward, and he's doing amazing things for other people like him in Harlem and beyond.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to tell these stories because it's also like this is the majority of people. Like, I just feel like we're being told this story about how this stuff happens. It just isn't accurate in terms of numbers. It is so disproportionate in terms of like who that story is about and what circumstance, and like those company, I don't know. It's just nonsense.
But it is inspiring when you start to collate these stories. I mean, that's been the most exciting thing for me is, you think, is this anecdotal? And then you look at the data, and the data says it's not anecdotal. The people who are shut out of most things, the people who are the fastest growing incarcerated population in this country are women and women of color since the 1970s. Like, the people who are basically getting the biggest shaft in our country also happen to be the most entrepreneurial. So it gives me so much hope, right? Because we're getting it done. Like, even when the odds are stacked against us, we're getting it done. And all we need is some tools to help us continue on the path that we're already on, and hopefully to do it faster. And when I kept thinking it was anecdotal, and then the data supported me, it made me realize that when other people think that the fact that most of my stories are women, and most of my stories in the book are women of color, and it isn't just women, there's some awesome men like John Henry that are in the book, people think it's sort of my strategy, my way to sort of, uplift and elevate these stories of people that aren't being heard. That's partly true, but part of it is honestly just math. Like, the majority of entrepreneurs look, sound, feel like the people in the book. So for me, it was less of a strategy, and it was more about like, we're just being accurate. We're representing entrepreneurship as it really is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So talk a little bit about like, okay, so everyone here on this, on watching this live cast now understands that they are in fact entrepreneurs. So like, where do they go from here?
I have one exercise in the book, which is one of my favorite things to do. I started doing it with artists, and I started doing it with people who don't necessarily think of themselves at first blush as entrepreneurs. And this is part of how I sort of got them there. But once they were there, to your point, I see that no matter how successful you are, I have seen the story repeat itself multiple times where people have success. They hit all the milestones that they were hoping to hit, and they hate their life, right? And so what I try to do is to tell people, before you even get on that train, let's think about what your ideal day looks like. And I'm not talking about like, my company has this much revenue and I have this many employees, and I'm talking about like you personally. Like, what does it look like? Where are you waking up? Are you on an island in Barbados? Are you, in the Bahamas, I should say? Or are you, in a skyscraper in New York City? Like, where are you? What does it look like? What are you having for breakfast? Who's sleeping next to you? Is someone sleeping next to you, right? Do you have kids? Do you not have kids? What does your day actually look like? That sort of perfect ideal day, not your day on vacation, your normal day, if you achieve what you have perceived, and what you've created in your mind is success. And that's so different for everyone. There are no two people whose day is going to be the same. And so what I try to get people to do is to visualize what that is and then write it down and make that your true north, so that as you're building your business and as you're deciding, do I take venture capital? Do I not take venture capital? Do I scale? Do I not scale? Do I expand into 5 different cities, or do I stay, homegrown in my city? You can still grow in your city. One of the examples in the book is the woman who started the Battery with her husband, which is this amazing club in San Francisco, right? She's an amazing part of the BRAVA family. And her name is Sochi Birch. And she decided, you know what? I have 3 kids, and my 3 kids are totally my priority. And so while it makes sense for most people that I would start the Battery in New York City and the Battery in London and the Battery in Miami and Chicago, that might be like the simple way to expand my business. She said, no, I have 3 kids. I have a life in San Francisco. I want to be rooted. This is what I want for me. So instead, she didn't say, screw it, I'm not going to scale my company. I'm going to stay small. She decided, I know software really well. I've spent my whole life building software. So what I'm finding is that there is no hotel or sort of event management or venue management software that I love. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a piece of software to help us run the Battery in San Francisco. And then as they built it, they realized that this was eminently shareable, that other people who own restaurants, who own venues, who own hotels could easily use the software. And that's what she's building. So she's still growing and she's still being big. She's still super ambitious about building that into $1 billion company, I hope. It does become $1 billion company, but she's still talking about expansion. She's just doing it in a way that is rooted in her perfect day. And I love that KZ, Catherine Zaleski, one of the co-founders of Power to Fly, talked about who's sleeping next to you.
I know. I'm like, you, Catherine.
KZ, come
on my vision board.
Climb into bed with us. But yeah, I mean, to me, that's the thing that I want people to start with. I want people rooted in their true north. So when the bullshit comes out them, telling them that they should do A, B, and C, the way that Sochi was told she should expand into all these different cities, if you're super rooted in your true north, you know exactly what to say yes and what to say no to, right?
Yeah, and I think actually a really good example of this is something I was thinking about today. We were at our all team meeting earlier this morning, and every time we go over sort of the vision of the mission of our company. And then I always talk about how part of the mission of our company is to also run the company in the way that we want to run it, right? It's not just about like realizing this mission of empowering women. It's also about being a workplace that feels good to us, that empowers women, that sort of lives up to all those things. So I think it's really important that, I think like the takeaway here is like, this is what's amazing about entrepreneurship to me is like, it's like, there's a couple of things that you have to be conscious of. And it's basically that like the money you bring in is greater than the money you put out, unless you're investing for a period of time. And then it's really just about like figuring out how you want that to look like and being really creative and making it what you want it to be. And I think like what you're really speaking to is like, don't get stuck in the idea that it has to be something that you see that you don't like, because those stories, as we're talking about, are like not at all representative of what it's really like. And B, like the whole purpose of it is that you can make it whatever you want it to be. I mean, within reason, obviously, like there are you can't completely, you can't just like wave a magic wand, as much as I try on the regular to do that.
But I will say this one thing that is important, and I think that I hope that I get this point across in the book, and I hope that it also just comes across not as a message that's like in the words, but also just like in the doing. Like the book is told as a series of stories, because I think that people don't remember the advice you give them. They remember the example that you set, right? Or they remember human stories. And so that's why your story and all the other stories in the book to me are much better vehicle for getting these messages across. Like I'm not just telling you what I think you should do. I'm showing you an example of 1 or 2 people who nailed it, right? And who did it exactly, so that you can model after that. But I also think that, Arlen Hamilton, who is in 3 places in the book, she just unveiled today, right, that she's on the cover of Fast Company. And I think that starts to me, because I often say, like, you know, people who look like us and who start businesses like ours and who have experiences like ours aren't on the cover of things. And then Arlen makes it to the freaking cover of Fast Company today, right? So I think that there's something to be said about telling your story, about sharing your leapfrogs, about not just seeing yourself as like a lone wolf somewhere, doing it in this unique way. People need to hear your story. People need to hear your leapfrogs. People, you know, need to be doing things like you do them. You could be quietly just training a bunch of women to learn to code and changing the world in your, you know, way without necessarily telling your story to the whole world. And I love the fact that you do and that you're out there. And I know that that means more work for us as founders, right? It means that on top of your day job, you're doing press, you're doing all the different sort of things that take time and energy out of our lives when we are telling our stories. But so be it. I know it's hard work. I'm not underestimating it, but I think it's important. I think that our sisters, you know, our colleagues, our fellow founders need this. And then I think that the next generation need it too, right?
Well, and luckily sometimes you get help, like when your friend writes about you in a book. I wanted to, as we wrap up, I just wanted to make a really important announcement, which is that we have a winner of our giveaway. So the winner of our Leapfrog giveaway is Lucian Gigante. I'm sure I did.
Yeah. Awesome. She's a Puerto Rican founder herself. She is amazing. She does this conference in Puerto Rico called Animus. And she has had everyone speak at it, including Justice Sotomayor, who I'm obsessed with.
Oh, amazing. Awesome. Yeah. Very deserving winner of our giveaway. Also, of course, if you guys are listening and are interested in learning more about technology and tech skills and whether that could be for you, I just want to remind everyone that you can sign up for the Skillcrush 10-day bootcamp. It's 100% free. And it's just a little sort of dip your toe in the water in terms of exploring whether tech might be for you. But Nathalie, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you for including me in your book. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for, you know, being the inspiration and the mentor that you are and have been. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for living a story worth telling everyone about.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think we all have stories, but yes, this is my little contribution, so I'm happy to offer it.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.